above that 5-handle yield you might get on money markets, you can put together a portfolio right now that's yielding 7 to 8%, extremely safe, and put on whatever duration you want. Whether you want to take on very little interest rate risk or whether you want to make a bet going out the curve in 5 to 10 year type of debt. So now's the time to be creative and to play quarterback, so to speak, on your fixed income portfolio.
Skylar, I just want to get your views quickly on one of the stocks we're watching in after hours today, New York Community Bancorp, NYCB. A huge drop after it flagged this $2.4 billion hit to earnings. Broadly, we're getting more concerns that are coming in around regional banks and especially those with high commercial real estate exposure. How concerned are you by that?
Banks are in trouble, and it's a double whammy here on one, securities valuation. If they own bonds, those bonds have fallen in value by about 5 points over the last, call it 3 months. Then that commercial real estate exposure is in a lot of trouble as well. Multifamily real estate's down 20 to 30%. Office is down 50 to 60. And so it really, you have to pick apart that bank's balance sheet and where their lending is going. But the likes of a New York community bank that has a lot of exposure to rent-controlled apartments in New York, a lot of exposure to multifamily, I don't see an end in sight really for a lot of that debt. You know, we're looking at some debt that these folks own where folks are looking to refinance at 14 to 16%. So folks are desperate to get their hands on debt almost at any cost. And so these banks are facing down huge markdowns.
All right, Skylar, thanks for your time. That was Skylar Weinan, CIO of Regan Capital there. And still ahead, we're actually going to have more on those NYCB news, taking that huge hit to its earnings. We've got a new leadership as well coming through to try and navigate this turmoil. So certainly a lot to be discussing. We'll have more details on that ahead. This is Bloomberg.
The world needs ways to reduce carbon emissions.
ExxonMobil can help.
We're working on solutions for our business
that can also help businesses like yours.
Heavy industry with low emissions. Let's deliver.
Can AI make chatbots act like your very own personal assistant? Yes, with ServiceNow.
Bye, honey.
Morning breath, huh?
Dr. Garcia? Whoa!
Reality checkup!
That's millions of bacteria growing overnight. Crest Pro Health helps prevent oral health issues before they start.
I'm so much fresher!
Crest.
You're a famous photographer, you're a conservationist, you're an activist. How would you define yourself?
I think I'm just a human trying to figure out how to be a better steward of our little planet. I am a biochemical engineer by training. I studied marine biology, fisheries, aquaculture, and then I realized that the ocean is very much out of sight and it needs help. And so I became a photographer to be able to communicate with a larger audience. And thank goodness I was good at it.
When did you realize that actually photography was your passion and you could make a real difference to our world?
You know, I didn't start out as being a photographer, so it was not until 1990-something, 96, when I picked up a camera. And I became a professional photographer soon after. And it's one of those things that it's like learning another language. You learn a few words, and then you put a few sentences together, and one day, you might be able to write poetry.
Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg. Context changes everything. It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, The China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, The China Show, premieres around the world Monday at 9 a.m. Hong Kong time on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Well, we're due to get China's February PMI data in a few hours. Bloomberg Economics thinks that this will show activity pulling back due to disruptions from the 8-day Lunar New Year holiday. The data release comes as China's top leadership pledges to meet economic targets for the year and maintain social stability. The 24-member Politburo will submit a government work report to a gathering of lawmakers next week. China's so-called two sessions, the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, begin on Monday. Our Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel looks at the many challenges faced by leaders gathering in Beijing.
The National People's Congress, or NPC, is China's annual session of parliament, convened usually every spring in the Great Hall of the People next to Tiananmen Square in central Beijing. Essentially, the NPC sets the political agenda for the year ahead, when the nearly 3,000 delegates from around the country get their marching orders on day one in the form of a lengthy work report from Premier Li Qiang. While regarded as the highest organ of state power, the NPC nevertheless operates under the direction of the Communist Party of China. The NPC, by design, legislates and executes the directives of the party. The roughly two-week affair is colloquially known as Lianghui, meaning the two sessions, as the NPC is preceded by a gathering of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, or CPPCC, an advisory body supposedly representing views from the broader society and business community, even though party membership is not required to be in the CPPCC. It is nevertheless directly supervised by the Communist Party.
Bloomberg's Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel there. Of course, the political pageantry begins next week. Well, talks at the World Trade Organization conference in Abu Dhabi have been extended to a fifth day. Member nations are struggling to reach agreements on a range of key issues. Bloomberg's Paul Allen joins us now, and I suppose this is tell us about how divisive the broader environment is.
Yeah, very complicated as well, and a lot of the areas of disagreement have to do with how the world's poorest people are treated. For example, there's the issue of stockholding, which has nothing to do with holding shares. It's about countries buying grains from farmers at predetermined prices. So it kind of looks like a subsidy, smells like a subsidy. But from countries like India's perspective, it's really about food security for 800 million poor people. But then from countries like Australia and Brazil's perspective, it's about not being able to sell fairly into that market. And it's a very big market as well. Fisheries is another area of a sticking point. And that's the same sort of thing. There's a lot of subsistence fishes out there that rely on these sorts of programs. And Indonesia's trade minister put it quite well, saying, look, this is about daily life and death of feeding people. Another issue is e-commerce. Currently, tariffs on e-commerce are prohibited. Indonesia would like this to lapse. And this is where we get into this interesting area of crossover, because e-commerce could be used as a bargaining chip for these movement on these other issues. So it just sort of illustrates the depth and complexity of what's going on.
And given that depth, given that complexity, what are the chances that this conference ends without an agreement or a statement?
Well, that's a very real possibility, that we get to 2 p.m. local time Friday and there is no agreement or statement. Another possibility is a watered-down statement that notes some of these unresolved issues. There are encouraging signs. I mean, we have to remember there's more than 160 countries involved here, and there is agreement on 17 paragraphs in the declaration so far. So talks are ongoing as well, and that really illustrates that there is a will to keep on pushing towards an agreement. The Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, she says some things are proceeding in a really good way, other things she's not so sure about. Ireland's Trade Minister noted that, there is some pessimism, but he also says that happens before agreements when you're having these sorts of difficult discussions. So there's still some hope that we might get a positive outcome at the end of this afternoon.
Right, wait and see for that one. That was Paul Allen there in Sydney. And let's take a look at some of the other geopolitical stories that we're tracking here, because President Biden says he's still hopeful for a temporary pause in fighting between Israel and Hamas, but it's unlikely to start by Monday, as he originally stated. The White House says Biden spoke with the leaders of Qatar and Egypt, who are working with the US to moderate ceasefire talks. The emerging agreement calls for a 6-week pause in fighting to allow for the release of hostages and prisoners and to get aid into Gaza. Dozens of Palestinians have been killed and injured in a shooting near a convoy of food trucks in northern Gaza. The Associated Press cites hospital officials saying Israeli troops opened fire on the crowds. Israel has denied its forces took part in the shooting, but says the incident is under review. President Biden says it threatens to set back efforts to negotiate that ceasefire. Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned that NATO risks triggering a nuclear war if it sends troops to Ukraine. He made the comment in his annual address to an assembly of lawmakers and officials. French President Emmanuel Macron has refused to rule out sending troops to Ukraine, an idea rejected by the White House and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And you can get a roundup of the stories that you need to know to get your day going in today's edition of Daybreak. Terminal subscribers go to DayBgo. It's also available on mobile in the Bloomberg Anywhere app. You can customize your settings so you only get news on the industries and the assets that you care about. This is Bloomberg.
The world needs ways to reduce carbon emissions.
ExxonMobil can help. We're working on solutions for our business.
That can also help businesses like yours. Heavy industry with low emissions. Let's deliver.
Everyone's talking about AI. But how can it help your business? Can it make chatbots act like your very own personal assistant? Yes. Put AI to work with ServiceNow.
I'm Alex Rodriguez. I'm a former New York Yankee and played professional baseball for over 20 years. Almost that entire time, I was thinking about business.
And I'm Jason Kelly. I've been a business journalist at Bloomberg for more than 2 decades. And across my career, I've covered everything from the Olympics to Wall Street.
From Bloomberg, this is The Deal. Each week, you'll hear us in conversation with business icons.
This show will explore deal-making across sports, media, and entertainment.
This is very fancy for a podcast.
If I knew what it was going to be, I'd have put everything I had into it.
I get asked more about our relationship than I do my wife. You know what I'm saying?
This is a show where we talk with big-time athletes and executives about the wins, the losses, and lessons learned along the way.
This show is called The Deal.
The Deal?
The Deal. The Deal.
That deal.
The Deal.
Huge deal.
Who dug this up? What are y'all in trouble?
DOJ or other authorities
Could face bigger challenges.
Britain's next.
It was going to keep Rain World Cup. This is a 3
As the economic picture.
covering the intersections of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and beyond.
I would say we've gotten to very frothy levels. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see some correction and some consolidation. But I'm very loath to pick a Bitcoin high because I really do believe this is price discovery.
That was the Galaxy Digital founder and CEO Mike Novogratz on Bitcoin there, and worth pointing out as well. I think he expects that consolidation to be somewhere down around that 50,000 mark before we see that reascend. Of course, Novogratz, a very well-known and long-standing Bitcoin bull, as he should be, given he's a huge investor in the space. But still, we have seen Bitcoin continuing to trade higher, and over the course of this week, it seems to sort of steadied somewhat that rally because we're sort of around the same level we were at 24 hours ago. But still, let's get more on the outlook and bring in our cross-asset reporter, Isabel Lee, joining us. And Isabel, I mean, yeah, Bitcoin price might be steady. What wasn't steady was the huge inflows that we saw into Bitcoin ETFs for another day. How sustainable do you think that this is?
That is the question, actually, because every day we've been seeing record after record. In fact, BlackRock again broke its record the other day. Today, we saw around 612 million in inflows, and that's the biggest among the group. And in all, the 10 ETFs saw around 673, and that's including the outflows that we've seen in Grayscale. But then the question is, will investors continue to plow in cash? And the answer is probably not, because if you look at trading volume today, it kind of petered out compared to the previous high we've seen the other day. But this isn't really surprising, because it's kind of a cycle. I don't want to say a vicious cycle, but as prices rise, it drives flows, and as flows increase, it drives their price, and vice versa. And now, as you've said, Bitcoin has steadied. I've had sources telling me today that they expect it to correct, and they want it to correct, because the market right now is looking too frothy. But for now, it seems like the floor we're looking at is around 60,000.
Despite it being widely available to the masses, we are still seeing some holdouts, right? Vanguard being one of them. But we're also hearing that some of these institutional names, like Bank of America's Merrill, are making it available on client request. Could this kind of drive the next leg of the rally?
Definitely. That's exactly what I'm hearing. We have Bank of America's Merrill arm today and Wells Fargo's brokerage unit. Bloomberg reported that they've started offering upon request. So that's usually the key thing that we hear of, upon request. So they cannot really offer it unsolicited. But still, it's a big sea change, because these big Wall Street firms have been holdouts for the longest time. And I have a lot of sources telling me also that, imagine we're seeing this demand and we still have holdouts. So what more when the dam opens? So we probably will be seeing massive inflows. And this is really interesting, because we know that inflows drive the price and price drive the inflows, because at the heart of this all is the simple supply and demand. And for now, the demand of Bitcoin is outpacing the supply, because long-term holders do not want to sell at this price because they want to hold it. So this is really an interesting space to watch. And Bloomberg has been reporting banks one after the other capitulating.
Bloomberg Cross asset reporter Isabel Lee there from New York. Take a look at trading here in Australia. We are seeing Australian equities now hitting that bull market territory, or set for that bull market territory if we get into this through to the close. The ASX 200 is up 20% from its 2022 low. If you take a look at how trading is going so far in the first sort of half an hour or so of trade, just two sectors are in the red. Communication services and healthcare are underperforming, but we're seeing very strong gains in the day, led by the miners. Materials up by 1.4%. Also, technology and consumer names looking quite strong as well. This is, we continue to kind of see the rise in iron ore from that 4-month low, and that's really driving a lot of that optimism that we're seeing renewed across the materials sector.
The world needs ways to reduce carbon emissions.
We're working on solutions for our business,
like carbon capture,
that can also help businesses like yours.
Heavy industry with low emissions. Let's deliver.
Everyone's talking about AI. But how can it help your business? Can it make chatbots act like your very own personal assistant? Yes. Put AI to work with ServiceNow.
You formed a partnership with Penny Pritzker at some point to do parking, is that right?
Yeah, so when I was working at JLL, that we went through this real estate recession in the early 90s, and the senior people at the firm said, let's do a retrospective on all these different asset classes to see what happened, how we overpaid, why we ran into so much trouble, what really happened in the marketplace. And when I did that, I recognized, well, there were a lot of reasons why I liked the parking assets better than I did office and retail and industrial. And so I started really noodling on the differences between those asset classes and came up with a rationale to start a business in the parking space. But I crossed paths with Penny Pritzker, who later became our Secretary of Commerce. And she liked the idea, and she and I went off on this adventure together and built a real estate operating company in the parking space.
Japan's labour market staying pretty tight in January, with these key gauges shown to be holding steady. That jobless rate for January holding at 2.4% from the previous month, also meeting expectations of 2.4% as well. The job to applicant ratio also unchanged at 1.27 as it was the previous month, and on expectations as well. We have really kind of seen manufacturers possibly increasing hiring in response to what we've seen as pretty good export numbers for autos, as well as, of course, the surge in demand for chip-related items. But at the same time, some of those concerns over service providers reducing job availability. We are seeing a bit of weakness across household consumption. Incomes are lagging living costs, particularly with the weakness that we see in the yen as well. So no surprises out of the labour market data, but Bloomberg Economics does expect that we'll see further tightness in that market for several months, again on those themes of manufacturing strength, retailers and services probably looking a little bit more cautious across that period. This, of course, comes as we're hearing some pretty interesting signalling from the Bank of Japan, as well as ex-Bank of Japan speakers, ex-Bank of Japan director, when it comes to Kazuo Momo, saying that liftoff is likely in April, not in March. But we had some pretty strong signalling when it comes to the suggestion that the price target range is coming into sight. Governor Ueda saying that they're looking at the wage data, but that the price target are not yet in sight. Just tempering those expectations, Belle. But of course, expectations are not high when it comes to China's growth story now.
That's right. I was just thinking, I mean, this is the country that's really at risk of so-called Japanification of its economy. But China, yes, it saw tremendous economic growth for decades, but it's now experiencing a slowdown, as we know, and one with consequences for the rest of the world. Bloomberg Originals has been taking a closer look.
China's economic growth was like nothing the world has ever experienced before. For most of the past 2 decades, the country's growth has been unstoppable.
This is an economy that became the world's factory floor by driving up tons and tons of expansion and becoming this giant manufacturing powerhouse.
But then that boom story came to a halt.
The stock market has lost some $6 trillion in value just over the last year and a half. There's the property crisis and all of the fallout from there. You're seeing rises in unemployment, particularly among the country's youth.
The challenge for the rest of the world is that this slowdown means China is now cutting back on spending.
Everybody from big multinational companies to ordinary people have been swept up in China's boom story. That's now coming to an end.
That means Louis Vuitton sells fewer handbags, Apple sells fewer iPhones, and Chinese funding on railways in Africa and ports in Europe dries up. In short, it's bad for the global economy. The question is, how bad?
Let's get more on the outlook for China's economy. And joining us in the studio this morning is Grace Ng, senior China economist at JP Morgan. And Grace, we just heard some of the challenges that are very well known that are facing China's economy. We're heading into that MPC next week, the 2 sessions. This is going to really set the economic priority for the rest of the year, or the economic priorities, but it's also that push to try and lift sentiment and repair very fragile confidence in China's economy. Are we going to get any closer to that, do you think, that lift in sentiment?
Yeah, indeed. This is an important event to watch out for. I think actually in terms of the general policy expectation, the tone has already been set by the Central Economic Work Conference in December. So what it seems is that if you look at the macro policy stance, it has generally turned to be more growth supportive since about August last year, when the reopening of the economy has led to somewhat of a disappointing recovery. I think what we are looking for going forward is that going into 2024, the government seems quite likely to set the growth target for the year at around 5%. If you compare to 5.2% growth last year, it doesn't seem too much of a difference. But what is important to know is that in 2023, we actually had a low base effect to compare with, and we had the reopening momentum, even though it was somewhat somewhat disappointing, at least you have that boost. So what that means is that it's actually going to be somewhat challenging to achieve 5% growth for this year, and therefore we do need to see a supportive growth policy for this year. So what that means is that for fiscal policy, for monetary policy, they would have to come in on a supportive side. So we are looking for instance, budgetary fiscal deficit target to be at 3.8% of GDP, which in effect would actually be more supportive than last year. And we are also looking for monetary policy to be complementary to the fiscal policy side of things to support growth, with overall aggregate credit growth, TSF, at about 9.5% for the year.
And would those sorts of measures, though, really be enough, do you think, to break that cycle of weak activity, falling prices as well in China?
Yes, indeed. The private side of the economy remains pretty challenging. So we are facing a significant slowing in the housing market that we have not seen since the housing market was being privatized in the late 90s. We are seeing deflationary pressure overall in the economy, and we are seeing private sector sentiment still pretty much on the soft side, both for the household sector as well as for the corporate sector. So what that means indeed is that while the private sector, the housing market, is still very much on a sluggish momentum, you do need to see policy support kicking up in order to offset that drag coming from the slowing housing market, poor private sector confidence. In that regard, what we have seen is in the past couple of months, we have seen some stepping up of policy support, including the 1 trillion additional fiscal deficit announced in late October, and the expectation of ongoing policy support on the fiscal side, as we mentioned before. And also importantly, on the monetary policy side, you are seeing the PBOC, for instance, pointing to supportive policy, including structural monetary policy tools, such as PSL, relending. So on the PSL side, we do see, for instance, a 1 trillion yuan program to support public housing, urban village renewal, and public infrastructure, and also relending facility to support other parts of the economy where the central bank wants to provide targeted support. So that's including industry upgrade, green economy, digital economy, elderly care, and so on.
Grace, it's a conundrum, isn't it? Because I do wonder how important is signalling the symbolism of that GDP target now. China doesn't miss growth targets, right? It's just simply not done. But at the same time, they want to inspire confidence by setting a reasonably high growth target. But if it's a solid 5%, you know, they could well miss that, right, without a strong fiscal stimulus effort. So do they give themselves a bit more flexibility and notch it down a little bit?
Yeah, indeed. This is an interesting question. The way we see it is that if we do not have meaningful policy support stepping up, the economy could potentially actually come in on the softer side, on the 4 handle, say around 4.4, 4.5% or so. But it's exactly as you mentioned, that the government wants to give that signal that economic growth is actually on a stable momentum by setting the growth target at around 5% again for this year, which will be more challenging than achieving 5% last year. And so what that means is therefore that you need to, at the same time as the private sector is on a soft momentum, to step up more on the policy support front. So as we mentioned earlier on, the support for public housing, for urban village renewal and infrastructure and so on, and monetary policy, structural monetary policy tools as kind of a pseudo-fiscal policy support. If that is still not enough, so for instance, if you still see meaningful downside surprise on the housing sector or private sector sentiments and the labor market conditions weaken further from here, then there would be pressure for policy support to step up further from here.
Grace, the demographics are also troubling in the medium to long term, right? Have you seen much progress when it comes to structural policy efforts, when it comes to domestic migration, for example, to try and ward off some of these risks?
Yes, indeed. I think the government does put quite a lot of emphasis on what they call the new urbanization efforts to support the migrant workers coming in from the rural area to settle in the urban cities. I guess in the very near term, it is somewhat encouraging that some of those migrant workers who have left the cities during the COVID lockdown period to go back to the rural area have come back. And so in the past 2-3 quarters, we have indeed seen the low-income household spending indeed picking up more momentum than the overall economy. So in the longer term, I guess one of the areas of supporting that new phase of urbanization is exactly this new public housing program that the policymakers are putting emphasis on to help those low-income households to settle down in the cities and therefore to unlock the potential demand momentum coming on from there. And I guess in terms of the aging population issue, demographics, there is that ongoing discussion with regard to issues such as raising the retirement age overall, and also improving the overall urbanization process and domestic demand and service sector part of the economy to offset some of the pressure coming from the aging population.
Grace, thanks so much for your time this morning. That was Grace, the senior China economist at JP Morgan. And subscribers can watch our full documentary on China's slowdown on the terminal or at Bloomberg.com. And starting next week, we're introducing a brand new program focused on Asia's biggest economy. Bloomberg's The China Show is your definitive source for news and analysis. Yvonne Mann and David Ingles will bring you all the market moves, plus in-depth discussions with key players. The China Show premieres at 9 a.m. Monday in Hong Kong. That's 8 p.m. Sunday night in New York. We'll have more ahead on Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg.
Can AI make chatbots act like your very own personal assistant?